This is topic 5.1 and 5.2 for AP Environmental Science. As we go through this presentation, make sure that you pay attention to the learning goals or the learning targets so that you can fill in your study guide as we go along. All right, so the first concept is called tragedy of the commons, and we're going to briefly go through how the tragedy of the commons occurs, what it is, and then you'll be assessed on it more when we study sustainability later in the unit. So this is kind of a little bit of an intro for your quiz. You'll have a few questions about this, and then the majority of this type of topic, including solutions to tragedy of the commons, will be on a further quiz. But first of all, let's go over this. We need resources as humans. We need food, we need shelter, we need other kinds of resources, minerals, etc. for the goods that we use. We need water. And so the land provides those things. Land is also valuable because intrinsic beauty, that means that we enjoy nature for what it is when we hike, when we fish, when we do things in nature. That's its intrinsic, means internal beauty. Okay, so humans like to use land, and there's public land or land that's used by many people in common. And this can also be a resource that's used in common, so not necessarily land, but water or air. And when many people use a resource, and it's overused because there's not a system set in place to avoid problems or overuse or depletion, we call it tragedy of the commons. All right, so it was first written up a long time ago about rangeland. And so if this is a common rangeland area, in other words, it is not private property, but this is a common use area, and you have your sheep here, well, everybody wants to graze as many sheep as they can so that they can sell as much wool as they can or as much meat as they can and make as much money as they can. And so if there's no rules set in place, then the grass becomes depleted. And so again, this is a common resource, belongs to everybody, not private property, and not regulated. So there are lots of examples of things that humans share in common. Global fisheries, so this means that a fishery is a place that you fish. And so each country off its own coast, there's maritime laws, so oceanic laws, saying the United States can control the waters. I'm not sure what it is, but it's something like 100 miles off of its coast. And beyond that is considered open to the world. Anybody can fish those waters, those fisheries. And so we would consider those global fisheries that don't belong to any country. Now, even within a country, even if the waters belong to a certain country, but they let anybody just fish on it, it's considered a commons. Or if any kind of public land, a national forest, a national park, the atmosphere are gases that we breathe, that we need, like oxygen to survive. The air pollution gases that we don't want are greenhouse gases. So our atmosphere is a common, we all share it. The oceans are a commons in most places. Public lakes, so there are public lakes that don't belong to a person. For example, there's 2 lakes up in the mountains near where I live. There's Lake Arrowhead and Big Bear Lake that are on the same mountain. One is a public lake called Big Bear, and so anybody can launch a boat, anybody can swim. But then there's Lake Arrowhead that's actually a private lake that's owned by the Homeowners Association. So a lake has to be a public lake, not owned by one person or a group of people. National forest. So this is not all forests. This is national forest land that's owned by the people of the United States. People own private land that has a forest on it. We're not talking about that. Drinking water is weird. In the eastern United States, it's managed as a commons, so everybody shares the drinking water. In the western United States, there are water rights. So a city might own the rights to a certain water supply, or a person might own the rights to a certain water supply. And so there's been a lot of water wars fought in the western United States since it was settled over water rights. City parks, national parks, state parks are all commons. Okay, so when we have a commons, a lot of times people use the commons without taking into effect or an understanding of what an externality is. So it's a cost that results from, but are not included in the purchase price of something. For example, if you buy a car and that factory pollutes the air, the price of the car, unless that company is forced to clean up the air that they polluted, and that costs money, the pollution price is not included in the price of the car unless that company has to clean the air. It's by law they have to. And in a lot of places they aren't. In some places like the United States, we have pollution laws. And so those companies do have to not pollute, and those prices are factored into the price of a car. But if those things are made in other countries where they don't have those laws, then we get cheap goods, but the people in that country pay the price for their polluted air. And so we call that an externality. Okay, and so here's some public lands. We have to understand that there are lands that are owned by the people of that particular country. And you can see that in the US, or on land, it's all the red. These would be national parks, state parks, etc. And then there are marine reserves as well. And they are protected areas. Okay, in the U.S. public land can be owned either as federal land like National Forest or the Bureau of Land Management land. There can be state-owned land like state parks. There can also be local city parks, county parks, etc. 42% of the land in the United States is publicly held, and you can see the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, owns most of the public lands that are rangelands where you see cattle grazing, mining, timber, recreation. The U.S. Forest Service manages our national forests, but some of the national forest areas also have rangeland for grazing, also recreation, camping, hiking, etc. The National Park Service keeps those areas pristine for recreation, for conserving biodiversity. Fish and Wildlife Service does wildlife conservation, but they also give permits for hunting and for recreation. The Forest Service can give permits to cut down trees, so that would be your timber. In the United States, we have laws, though, that say that if you cut down trees, you have to replant them in most cases in national forests. And you can see here, it's kind of interesting, the color code. Most of our public lands are in the western United States because of when people realized they needed to protect national lands. So the eastern United States started being settled in the 1600s, and then people moved west. And then by the 1900s, people went, oh, we need to save some of these lands in a common area so people can enjoy and use these lands like national parks. And the land that was left that wasn't privately owned was mostly in the western United States. By the time people realized they should preserve land, most of this had been privately owned through land grants, the Homestead Act, etc. All right, so you need to know what a rangeland is. So you can see a picture right here. So these are dry, open grassland for grazing cattle. It's the most common use of land in the United States. When it's overgrazed, so too much cattle on one place, then it can lead to erosion of soil because the roots aren't there. If the cattle eats too much grass, then there's not going to be roots to hold the soil in place. You can have biodiversity loss, etc. Forests, of course, are dominated by trees and other woody vegetation and can be used for commercial logging. So you can cut down the trees and sell it. You can get a permit in a national forest and people bid for those permits. The national forests were set aside so there would be a steady source of timber in the United States to be used. And they wanted our forests to stay because they're a natural resource. People need wood to build things, they need paper, and if they were all cut down and never replanted back, then that leaves the US in an economic problem. And so 100 years ago or so, they decided to set aside national forests to prevent that from happening. So we manage this, that even though it's allowed to be logged, you have to replant. Okay, let's talk about clear cutting. So there is clear cutting in the United States. You can see a picture here. It's where they just take down the whole forest in a certain patch. And this is cheaper and safer for loggers, but it has the worst habitat destruction. So you cut down all the trees, and this is how it's going to regrow, where they're all the same age of trees. You're going to limit the biodiversity, not just of your trees and plants, but your animal species. Because remember, animal species have niches. Some live in the tops of trees, some live in older trees, some live in some species, some live in other species of trees. And so you're going to limit the biodiversity of the animals as well. Now, this is a different type where it's selective cutting, where you only cut down certain trees in the forest. And so you're going to leave some older trees there, and so you're going to have a better biodiversity there. So we have different types of cutting down of trees. We have clear cutting. Take a minute and pause the video and read through the pros, read through the cons. And then selective cutting is where you only cut down a few trees in the forest. Read the pros, read the cons. In some states, they do different things. For example, my cousins live in northern Idaho. They do selective cutting. In Washington State, they do clear cutting. There again are pros and cons of each that you have to know. I'm not going to read through the whole list. You can pause the video. You can read through the whole list. One of the problems with clear cutting is that you're going to make an area hotter. So trees absorb heat, and without the trees, the heat is going to be absorbed into the earth instead of the trees kind of reflecting back some of that heat, taking care of that heat. So without trees, more heat is absorbed into the earth and less water is evapotransported, which you can see a picture of here, which cools down an area. All right, let's talk about clear cutting and contaminating water with nutrients. So if you've got less soil. So if you are clear cutting, look at all this loose soil. The trees are not there to hold the soil in place. And so you end up with more soil and sediments in the water. And the soil and sediments contain nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. And so that nutrients can end up in the water. Now, if there's a lot of that nutrients, you can end up with eutrophication, but mostly that's from fertilizer runoff. Okay, how does clear cutting impact biodiversity? Well, species that need shade are going to decrease. There's no shade. Species like the sun, though, are going to increase. So you're going to have this boom of sun-loving species. And then biodiversity will shift. So you might have less shade, more sun species. Overall biodiversity goes down, but you are going to have a little bit of shift. It's not going to go away completely. You're going to have your sun-loving species there. So it's going to shift. All right, some other problems. We have habitat fragmentation. Take a look at this picture. We have these islands of habitat that we learned, islands of habitat, back in Unit 2. And so if there's a species that does not like the sun, for example, they have to go around these clear-cutted areas. And so anytime you have habitat fragmentation, you're going to end up with less biodiversity overall. We have something called edge effects. So edge effects are the edges of habitat. So if you have your forested habitat, everywhere around the clear-cutted area is an edge, and edges have less biodiversity. And then if you cut down these patches and you burn the trees, in some parts of the world they do that. For us, we're going to sell the trees. We're not going to burn them right there to get rid of them. But in some places where they don't want it, it's too expensive to, like if you're in the middle of the rainforest, for example, and you cut down the trees because you want to farm that land, then you're just going to burn the trees to get rid of them. You don't have the funds or the money to take the trees to sell the trees for wood, or maybe there's just not a market to sell the trees for wood. In the US, most of these trees that are cut down, they are used for building or for paper. Most is not used for firewood, but some is, but not on that location. But if you cut down trees and burn them, then you're going to release that stored carbon into the atmosphere. Okay, so we have selective cutting that we've talked about as well. And so selective cutting only leaves small openings in the forest. It has some effects of clear cutting, but in a smaller area. It's not as good economically because you've got to go back and forth to the forest. You can only harvest smaller amounts at a time. It's also less safe because if you clear cut, it's actually safer machinery for loggers than if you cut this tree and that tree in the forest, because as trees fall, they can get stuck on other trees, and then how they fall can be unpredictable for loggers. So it's actually safer to clear cut than it is to selective cut. Another alternative to clear cutting is ecologically sustainable forest. Okay, so for this quiz for 5.2, most of your questions are going to be about clear cutting. You can see on your study guide that there's a little bit about solutions to clear cutting, but I'm going to tell you that later in this unit, we're going to have a whole topic on sustainable forestry where we're going to talk about this stuff more. Selective cutting, ecologically sustainable forestry. You can pause the video and read about this, but you will not have this particular slide on your next quiz. I just wanted to introduce it to you. Another thing that can help clear cut is reforesting the tree reforesting the land when you're done. If you plant all the same species of tree, however, you're going to end up with tree plantations. So they do that. They'll cut down a forest with all different species of trees and they'll replant it with pine, because pine will grow in 20 years. They can harvest it again. But you don't have the biodiversity of trees, which means you have less biodiversity of animals because of their niches. So this is just a little review of some laws that can help prevent clear cutting in certain places that are ecologically delicate. You can use a law called the National Environmental Policy Act. You can use the Endangered Species Act that can help save certain areas of forest from logging in certain places where they want to protect the forest. And that's just a little review of the Endangered Species Act and then an introduction to NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. Now these laws will not be on your quiz, but I wanted to show you that that can be a solution to clear cutting, is to try and protect an area through the use of laws. All right, and that's it for 5.1 and 5.2.